and we got to let the folks know, we were workshopping this one a little bit, and I got to give a shout out to producer Dimitri. He was like, look, this is the biggest topic right now in women's basketball on the internet. We probably need to discuss. And I'm going to bring this topic into the conversation by saying this first. I do not believe we have even surpassed the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the exposés, the biographies, the realistic fiction that could come about because of the Caitlyn Clark effect and Caitlyn Clark's rise and what it has done for the profile of women's basketball, both professionally and at the amateur level. And so I say all that to say there are two such books that are, one of them is already out, and I'm excited to hear because you have finished our friend Howard Megdal's wonderful biography of Caitlyn Clark that has already been released. Mitch has already finished it. It's on next on my to-do list of books to read. Shout out to my Kindle. And then Christine Brennan, perennial, longtime national sports columnist, and her involvement in the W, stemming back to last September, has been rather fascinating, especially, Mitch, as someone like myself, who I do want to note, I have corresponded with Christine before. I heard her speak when I was a young pup and have always respected her work and do respect her. But this has become another lightning rod in the Caitlyn Clark saga and has once again become the talking point, not just in the women's basketball space, but in the sports media landscape at large.
I'm going to be pretty long-winded here.
Okay, I'm gonna get my water bottle and I'm gonna put my feet up, and I know the listeners are as well.
Okay, I have several things to say about Christine Brennan's book and Christine Brennan's overall coverage of the WNBA and Caitlyn Clark dating back to last year. I have respect for Christine Brennan in regards to what she has done in her career up to this point, how she broke barriers for women in sports journalism and all that she has covered. She is an accomplished sports writer. Having said that, I find it extremely weird, and I've said as much to many of my colleagues who are in the women's sports media space, that she has made this hard pivot in her career to being the person that is Caitlyn Clark's chief defender, and also someone who, quite frankly, is further pushing two narratives that are not true, and I think harmful to how women's basketball is perceived. The first is the notion that other players in the WNBA are jealous of Caitlyn Clark, and because of that, they are being overtly physical with her, or they are being, quote, petty towards her, as I saw Dick Vitale say on Twitter last week in regards to players not voting her as one of the top choices to the All-Star team. A quick aside.
Shout out Dickie V. We do love you, Dickie V. He got another positive cancer screen, or no cancer screening today. Shout out Dickie V. We love you guys. We just have questions about your understanding of the greater picture at play here.
Yeah. Shout out to Dick Vitale, but I've never seen him talk about women's basketball ever. And Caitlyn Clark has missed 9 of the Fever's 18 games this season. And the fact is that there were players who were more healthy, more consistent, and more deserving of those votes in this specific sampling of 18 games. Back to Christine Brennan. Aside from that incident with Kennedy Carter, I don't think Caitlyn has been a victim of any cheap shots or contact that were not basketball plays. The times that she's gotten poked in the eyes, those happened while a defender was defending her the right way. You could maybe make the case for the Marina Mabry thing being over the line. But again, like, Caitlyn Clark has never been punched or suplexed or actually been injured by any one of these moments.
She did get decked once by Stewie on a screen, but again, it was a basketball play, and Caitlyn immediately in the postgame said, it's a basketball play.
Yeah. I think Paige Beckers recently got decked by an Alyssa Thomas screen, and didn't hear anybody cry about that.
No, Natasha Howard got decked. 6'5", 6'6", whatever her frame is, and she was like, "I'm getting too old for this," or whatever her quote was from over the weekend. It happens. It's a basketball play.
Yeah. So I also just hate that, like, we, not you and I, but people in this space are using this words like jealousy and pettiness so much when we talk about women's basketball. I've actually listened to a couple of the interviews that Christine Brennan has done for this book, and she uses the word jealousy quite often. My thing is, like, if players don't like Caitlyn Clark, that should be okay. That's competitiveness. That's sports. The WNBA players do not need to appreciate Caitlyn Clark and treat her with kid gloves. We had guys who hated Michael Jordan, who hated Tiger Woods, who hated Dale Earnhardt, who hated Larry Bird and Magic Johnson.
Who hate LeBron currently.
We never collectively, as a sports watching community, demanded that these guys be universally appreciated. And people like Dick Vitale and Christine Brennan need to treat women's basketball like an actual sport and stop being so damn patronizing about it. The second thing that Brennan, I think, is perpetuating is this false idea that Black people hate or resent, or let's use the buzzword again, are jealous of Caitlyn Clark. There's no real proof of that. And the way that she talks about that in sort of these dog whistle phrases, and how she often references how Caitlyn is a white player in a league that is 74% Black. I don't want to straight up call her a right-wing grifter, but her willingly going on an Outkick podcast, a news organization that we have talked about on this podcast before, to promote her book kind of tells me everything I need to know about it.
Or at the very least, who the target audience of the book is, which
Indeed.
is the mainstream. Not to say that the mainstream is right-wing, but it's those who have come to watch women's basketball largely because of Caitlyn Clark, and because that is the only real player in their purview, which is unfortunate, because I think that there is a large portion of the mainstream that has come to the W in the last 2 years and has been exposed to other great players and has now found a way to identify with those players and root for those players just as much as Caitlyn. But because the mainstream just knows Caitlyn Clark, that's why she goes to where perhaps the generalized surface level reporting, or not even reporting, retelling of what occurred in the W last night is actually taking place.
Yeah. And so like that brings me to the whole exchange that she had between, with her and Dejanay Carrington that blew up last season and has resurfaced this week following this book excerpt that was published at CNN that reads like a 3,000 word Yelp review of a restaurant that Christine Brennan didn't like. Christine Brennan wants to act like her questions of Dejanay existed in this vacuum, like she was asking a pitcher about why he beaned a batter. But anyone who watches that video that Christine Brennan recorded and posted, by the way, of that interaction between the two of them can tell that she's intentionally trying to poke the bear and provoke and get a reaction. And I think anyone that saw the video of Dejanay's inadvertent eye poke of Caitlyn Clark could tell that that was not intentional. And Christine Brennan talks about all the time about how she would have asked these same questions in NFL locker rooms in 1984. Well, this isn't 1984 anymore. And I find it also hard to believe someone who says that she's covered many Olympics, that she doesn't know what the Carmelo Anthony 3 to the dome celebration is, that's been around for like 15 years. And if she truly didn't, then it kind of shows how out of touch she is. And maybe she wasn't the right person to write a Caitlyn Clark book at this moment in time.
There have also, and I don't know if you can confirm this, Mitch, but I know people have asked me, and from what I have seen, I don't know if Caitlyn, outside of media availabilities, actually gave a one-on-one to Christine.
She did not. I think
she did to Howard, though. To Howard, she did give multiple one-on-ones.
The whole way I think that Christine Brennan framed her questions to Dejanay and everything sort of that she has said and done since then, I think has just further cemented her place as the person who is always going to cape up for Caitlyn Clark, and the person who is always going to say that the league was and still is unprepared to deal with a white star of her magnitude, and the person who is, perhaps not directly, but clearly implying that Black fans and players are against Caitlyn Clark. And I think in this media space that we live in now in 2025, sadly, there is a market for that person and that voice. And again, like, she went on Outkick. And I'm sure that if she didn't have a relationship with CNN, she might be on Fox News talking about this book as well, if she hasn't been already. I don't know.
I just want to know, like, how has no one said to her, like, you gotta read the room? Like,
yeah, like, are you sure about this?
Like, don't get me wrong.
Sure?
Like, I understand as someone who my primary beat is the NFL, and while I have covered women's college basketball since 2015. I did not really dive into the W until the last 2-3 years. I will openly say that. And I would also like to note that that's part of why I love working with Mitch each week on this podcast, because I learn. I've reached out, as some of the listeners of this pod who work professionally in the bigwigs of the national media know, I've reached out to many of you because I want to learn more. And for someone who has been regarded as one of the journalists of our time to basically rest on the laurels of I covered 6 Olympics, and so therefore I can cover women's basketball, that's a little disappointing as someone who idolized that person. And I would like to think, even as you are in the glory days of your career and you are regarded as one of those perennial voices in all of sports, that you still would take the time to learn the landscape. I will admit, like I said, I know I butcher names of NFL players too. Like, try to get me to say Ndamukong Suh on the radio, and like, it's a 50-50 chance I pronounce it right. And that's not because I don't know his name. It's just because I can't pronounce things. But point being, like, if you're going to come into the space, you should respect the people that are there. And I'm not talking about, privilege, or I'm just saying in general, like, if you're a plumber, right? Or you want to become a plumber, but you've been a carpenter your whole life, you should probably go talk to other plumbers. Like, just reading the manual is not enough. You should probably go talk to other plumbers and get their take on things. And that's what's most disappointing for me. And ultimately, at some point in time, you have to read the room. Like, how can you not acknowledge that clearly there is a portion of the fan base in terms of women's basketball coverage who would not feel so great about you going with certain outlets and having those conversations in a live public format, unless you have said, I don't even care about those fans. They're not going to read the book anyways.
Yeah, I just, the women's basketball media space is a different media space than the NFL or the NBA or whatever. To your point, Christine Brennan likes to talk about her resume all the time. And I would just like to point out, I've covered the WNBA and women's college basketball for about 8 years now. I've covered every Final Four since 2019. I've never seen Christine Brennan at a Final Four or a Sweet 16 or any college game. I haven't seen her at the handful of WNBA playoff games that I covered in 2018 and since then. I know she was with the Fever for a lot, last year, writing and reporting on this book. But before that, she wasn't really in these spaces. And to me, like, that's just further evidence that she isn't really familiar with the current players and culture of today's game. And she doesn't really care about telling the stories about the players and the coaches in today's game. She parachuted into the WNBA in 2024 because she saw an opportunity to make some money on writing a book about Caitlyn Clark, and saw an opportunity to defend the person, to be the person that defends her and positions Caitlyn Clark as the WNBA's great white savior. About the book specifically, I haven't read it. I'm not totally sure that I will read it. I did read the excerpt at CNN. I find it telling that in the only excerpt, I can't say that word, excerpt of the book.
It's because of me. It's because of Ndamukong Suh. It's rubbed off on you. That's on me.
Yeah. I find it telling that in the only sampling of this book that we've gotten so far, the one that was published at CNN, it's not really about Caitlyn Clark at all. It's about framing Dejanay Carrington and Alyssa Smith and DeWanna Bonner as villains and bullies, quite frankly. And apparently what they did and said to Christine Brennan, it's really just Brennan's first-person account of all that happened last October after the inadvertent eye poke and her questions of Dejanay. I think it's telling that in writing that chapter, Brennan includes a few short and precise barbs thrown in her way by people like Megan Rapinoe and Lindsay Gibbs, both of whom I respect a whole lot, and then has these long defenses of her by people like Jake Tapper. I read the AP's review of the book, and I think it backs up everything that we're saying here. So this is, quote, Clark's race and the frosty reception she got from some in the league is returned to again and again, with Brennan and the people she talked to asserting with incredulity that the WNBA wasn't ready for all the attention. I also think it's telling, like you mentioned, that Caitlyn Clark did not grant Christine Brennan a one-on-one interview for this book. And from what I've been told, nobody particularly close to Caitlyn granted her an exclusive interview either. Now, she was at press conferences and scrums and things like that, but not a deep one-on-one conversation. Just to go back to that AP review, it continues, quote, "It speaks to the divisive us versus them moment in the world that the world finds itself in, but fans looking for tidbits about Clark that are not already part of the public record, how she learned to shoot, her on and off court life. We'll have to stay tuned to the current WNBA season." So the AP review tells me that there isn't really much in this book that is revealing
she didn't talk to anyone.
In terms of Caitlyn Clark. And if the book is anything like this excerpt, it's just going to be a book full of Christine Brennan complaining about how she's been treated and how she perceives Caitlyn to be by the WNBA, its players, and the media.
I shouldn't say she didn't talk to anyone because clearly she was in scrums and she did interview people. So we'll put that out there. And I would also just like to, before I give Mitch the final word on this week's main event, I would just like to say hello to Chloe Peterson of the Indy Star and Scott Agnes of the Fieldhouse Files, who both do a great job. And I just would like to we appreciate both of you.
Yeah, shout out to them.
Who may unfortunately have gotten caught in the crossfires of all this. So I would just like to say thank you, Scott. Thank you, Chloe. We appreciate your coverage. Go Hawks.
I value like people who have been in these spaces, like their opinions a whole lot. And so when I hear someone like Cheryl Reeve, the coach of the Minnesota Lynx, say that, quote, "There are people who have not followed the WNBA that are now following because of Caitlyn Clark, and Christine Brennan is one of them." I take that into account quite a lot. She also called Brennan,
because she was the coach of Team USA, a team that Christine Brennan covered.
Right. She also called Brennan opportunistic and said what she wrote is fiction, and then also said she likes to have a villain in her storytelling, unquote. I do want to say that I have just finished Howard Megdal's book, Becoming Caitlyn Clark, which I think is excellent and fantastic and deeply reported. And I will just preface this by saying that Howard is someone who I consider to be a friend and a mentor. So if folks want to take this with a grain of salt, that's fine. But Howard is someone who has covered the WNBA and women's college basketball for many, many years. He's been in these spaces. He cares about the sport, about growing it, about improving the storytelling around it. And I think he's earned the trust of a lot of important players and coaches. One example, Lisa Bluter wrote the foreword for his book. Another, Jan Jensen gave Howard her grandmother's diaries. Another, C. Vivian Stringer invited Howard into her home for a long interview. My takeaway from Howard's book is I think what it does is it tells us the how and the why of Caitlyn Clark, and it properly contextualizes all the things that made her meteoric rise possible. ESPN wasn't even broadcasting every game of the women's NCAA tournament until 2019. The NCAA wasn't allowing for March Madness iconography to be used by women until 2022. Yep. The WNBA didn't start advertising during the NCAA tournament until 2024. The WNBA, just before Caitlyn Clark arrived in the league, got its best television contract ever. NIL was happening in women's college basketball while she was at Iowa. So you had a player appearing in ads during the NCAA tournament that she was in, further familiarizing the fan base and, diehard fans and casual fans. And, that could have happened if they had NIL at this time with Diana Taurasi or Candace Parker or Maya Moore or Brittany Griner, Brianna Stewart, Sabrina Ionescu, on and on and on. All those players that were very popular and selling out arenas and all those things. I think Howard's book does a really great job in contextualizing how women's basketball was being mismanaged and neglected by sort of the most powerful institutions involved in it before Caitlyn Clark came about, and how she was kind of the catalyst for this perfect storm in terms of amplifying the audience and the viewership and pushing the sport into the mainstream. And the way her arrival coincided with rebranding the NCAA tournament, ESPN showing more games, and the arrival of Kathy Engelbert as commish. Like, all this stuff just happened in the last 6-7 years. It wasn't that Caitlyn snapped her fingers and all this changed, which is, I think, what Christine Brennan and a lot of folks seem to imply all the time. This wasn't a big bang. It was a long road of stops and starts in terms of momentum building, and we had been building towards this moments like the 2023 Final Four and the 2024 Final Four for a while. And I also think that Angel Reese's role in all that is not insignificant either. And she gets overlooked far too often for her role when we talk about that boom for the sport.
Right.
I think the other thing that Howard's book does is it really tells the importance in the history of women's basketball in Iowa.
Yay! I was going to end with that. Thank you, Mitch.
I know you know very well. And like how if Caitlyn Clark had been born in another state or gone to another school,
if she'd gone to Notre Dame like she initially intended to,
she may not become what she has become. There were a lot of states that Howard writes about very, very well and detailed that banned women's basketball in the mid 1900s, and Iowa was one of the few that didn't, which allowed, I think, for the culture around the 6-on-6 game that they had to grow, and that grew and ingrained certain elements of that game like pace and space into girls across the state. And it just kept growing. And then when Vivian Stringer comes to Iowa in the 80s and pledges to fill Carver Hawkeye Arena and then does it, that leads to what you see around Iowa now, I think. So I highly recommend Howard's book. I can't say the same for the other one.
I, again, will just note that while I have not covered the professional space, I have specifically covered the University of Iowa since 2015 and the women's basketball program. And more importantly for this conversation that we can end on, and then we'll get to making money with Mitch, because I know we want to get to picks for this week, the high school world of sports in Iowa, which what you have to remember for those of you listening in a city or a state where you have a professional sports team, there are no professional sports teams in the state of Iowa. Their high school teams are their college teams, and their college teams are their pro teams, and they love sports there. What is also important to note, and I hear Lisa in my head right now, Lisa Bluter, because she was the one who took me aside and really gave me the backstory of the history with Dr. Christine Grant. And this idea of not just at the University of Iowa was there an athletic director for both the women's sports and then the men's sports, but in the state of Iowa to this day, and trust me, because I covered it, it is one of, I believe, only two, and I think it now may be the only one in the union that there is a separate high school union for the boys and the girls. You have the IHSAA, which oversees the boys' sports, and you have the IGHSAU that oversees the girls' sports. It is rare to see in 2025, but a positive byproduct has been that is the idea of the Iowa girl, and the branding is everywhere from the time that they are in middle school through the high school state championships. The idea of the Iowa girl is promoted, and that is why, to Howard's point, if Caitlyn Clark grew up in New Jersey, I don't know. And trust me, I'm from the state of New Jersey. Marina Mabry and her sisters were playing down the street from me.
And Hidalgo and Michaela Blake's.
Shout out Olivia Miles and all of my New Jersey brethren. But I don't know if it has the effect colloquially, and I say that in an endearing and loving way. Like, I don't know if at the grassroots level it has the effect in New Jersey that it did in Iowa, and in turn spread throughout the country. So yes, I have only listened to the interviews that Howard has graciously done with Richard Deitch and a couple of others so far promoting the book, but I'm very, very excited to read it.